The dawn broke over the Amazon rainforest with a violence that only those who live on the edge of civilization understand. The sky, painted in shades of crimson and gold, seemed to bleed over the dense canopy that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. In the small town of São Gabriel da Cachoeira, located in the northernmost tip of Amazonas state, Brazil, the air was thick with humidity and the promise of rain. The smell of wet earth mixed with wood smoke from the early morning fires, creating an atmosphere that was both comforting and ominous. Marcelo Santos stood on the wooden porch of his modest house, a structure built on stilts to protect against the seasonal floods that plagued the region. At 43 years old, his face bore the marks of a life spent under the merciless sun and within the unforgiving embrace of the jungle. Deep lines etched around his eyes, not from laughter, but from years of squinting into the distance, always searching, always vigilant. His hands, calloused and scarred, told stories of encounters with wild animals, thorny vegetation, and the occasional slip of a machete blade. Behind him, 3 dogs stirred in their wooden shelter. Trovão, a muscular Brazilian feeler with a coat the color of dried tobacco, was the leader of the pack. His eyes, amber and intelligent, missed nothing. Beside him, Relámpago and Corisco, 2 mixed-breed hunting dogs with the agility of deer and the loyalty of saints, stretched and yawned, their breath visible in the cool morning air. These were not pets. They were Marcelo's partners, his lifeline in a world where a single mistake could mean the difference between returning home and becoming another cautionary tale whispered around village fires. Marcelo's wife, Claudia, appeared in the doorway behind him, holding a tin cup of strong black coffee. At 38, she was a woman of remarkable strength, both physical and emotional. Her indigenous heritage showed in her high cheekbones and the way she moved, with an economy of motion that spoke of someone who understood the value of energy conservation in a hostile environment. Her dark hair, streaked with premature grey, was pulled back into a practical braid that hung between her shoulder blades. "You're leaving early today," she said, her voice neither questioning nor accusatory. It was simply a statement of fact. After 18 years of marriage, she knew better than to try to dissuade him from his work. "Miguel sent word last night," Marcelo replied, taking the coffee and wrapping both hands around the warm metal. "A jaguar has been killing cattle at the Ferreira ranch. 3 calves in the last week. They're desperate. The compensation from the environmental agency takes months, and they can't afford to lose more animals." Claudia nodded, understanding the economics of survival that governed their world. The Ferreiras were not wealthy ranchers, but struggling farmers trying to carve out an existence on the edge of the protected forest. A jaguar, magnificent as it was, represented an existential threat to their livelihood. "How long will you be gone?" she asked. 3 days, maybe 4. The tracks Miguel described sound fresh. "If I can locate the cat quickly, I might be back sooner." What Marcelo didn't say, what he never said, was that tracking a jaguar was among the most dangerous activities a person could undertake in the Amazon. These were not the desperate, undernourished predators found in zoos. These were apex predators in their prime, weighing up to 250 pounds of pure muscle and instinct, capable of crushing a skull with a single bite, their jaws exerting over 2,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. Their 13-year-old daughter, Isabella, emerged from the house, her school uniform already on despite the early hour. She had her mother's features but her father's eyes, constantly observing, always analyzing. She carried herself with the peculiar mix of childhood innocence and premature maturity common to children raised on the frontier. "You're going after the jaguar," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Will you kill it?" The question hung in the humid air between them. Marcelo set down his coffee cup and knelt to meet his daughter's gaze at eye level. This was important. This was about more than just a hunting expedition. "I hope I won't have to," he said carefully. "My job is to track it, to understand its patterns. Sometimes if we can identify why a jaguar is hunting cattle, we can solve the problem without killing the animal. Maybe it's injured and can't hunt its normal prey. Maybe there's been a disruption in the forest that's driven it toward human settlements. But Isabella, you need to understand something important. If that jaguar poses an immediate threat to human life, if there's no other option, then yes, I will do what needs to be done to protect people. Isabella nodded slowly, processing this information with the seriousness it deserved. She had been raised to respect the forest and its inhabitants, to understand that humans were not the masters of this environment, but merely another species trying to survive within it. Yet she also understood the harsh calculus of frontier life, where sometimes impossible choices had to be made. Marcelo stood and turned his attention to his equipment, laid out on a wooden bench with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. His rifle, a reliable bolt-action Rossi with a scope he'd saved 3 months to purchase, was already cleaned and loaded. Beside it lay his machete, its blade worn but sharp enough to shave with. A canvas backpack contained his supplies: dried meat, farina, 2 plastic bottles of water, a basic first aid kit, rope, a tarp for shelter, matches in a waterproof container, and a satellite phone that represented a significant financial investment but could mean the difference between life and death if something went wrong. He also carried something less conventional, a small leather pouch containing various plant materials. His grandmother, an indigenous woman from the Baniwa tribe, had taught him which plants could treat infections, which could reduce fever, and which could, in desperate circumstances, ease unbearable pain. Modern medicine was often days away in the rainforest, and traditional knowledge had saved his life more than once. By 6 in the morning, as the sun climbed higher and the oppressive heat of the day began to assert itself, Marcelo was ready. The dogs, sensing the imminent departure, circled his legs with barely contained excitement. Trovão, ever the professional, sat at attention, his ears forward, waiting for the command to move. Marcelo kissed Claudia, a long, meaningful embrace that carried the weight of unspoken fears and absolute trust. He hugged Isabella, feeling her thin arms wrap around his waist with surprising strength. "Be safe, Papai," she whispered. "Always," he replied, though they both knew it was a promise no one in his profession could truly keep. The journey to the Ferreira ranch would take most of the morning. Marcelo loaded his equipment and the dogs into his battered Toyota pickup truck, a vehicle held together more by faith and improvisation than original factory parts. The road, if it could be called that, was a red dirt track that turned into an impassable mud river during the rainy season. Now, in the dry season, it was merely treacherous, with ruts deep enough to swallow a wheel and clouds of dust that coated everything in a fine red powder. As he drove, Marcelo's mind wandered to the task ahead. Jaguar behavior was complex and influenced by numerous factors. A healthy jaguar typically avoided humans, preferring the deep forest where prey was abundant and encounters with people rare. When a jaguar began hunting cattle, it usually indicated a problem. Perhaps the cat was old or injured, unable to successfully hunt the agile prey it would normally target. Perhaps deforestation had disrupted its territory, forcing it into proximity with human settlements. Perhaps it had simply learned that cattle were easier targets than wild prey, a dangerous lesson that often ended badly for the animal. Miguel Ferreira met him at the property entrance, a man in his early 50s with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent every day of his life working under the sun. His hands trembled slightly as he shook Marcelo's hand. Whether from fear, exhaustion, or too much coffee, it was hard to tell. "Thank God you're here," Miguel said, his relief palpable. "It took another calf last night. Right there, not even 200 meters from the house. My wife heard something but thought it was just the wind. This morning we found what was left." Marcelo followed Miguel to the site, the dogs already working, their noses to the ground, cataloguing the thousands of scents that humans could never perceive. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. The kill was fresh, no more than 8 hours old. But more importantly, the manner of the kill told him everything he needed to know about the predator they were dealing with. This was no desperate, wounded animal making clumsy attacks. The bite marks on the calf's skull were precise, the classic jaguar killing technique. A bite powerful enough to pierce the skull and scramble the brain, resulting in instant death. The cat had fed efficiently, taking the choicest parts and leaving the rest. This was a healthy, capable predator that had made a calculated decision that cattle were preferable prey, which meant the situation was far more dangerous than Marcelo had hoped. The tracks led into the forest, clear as day to someone with Marcelo's experience. The jaguar was a large male, probably weighing close to 230 pounds based on the paw print dimensions. It was moving with confidence, not bothering to hide its trail. This was an animal that felt secure in its environment, that didn't view humans as a threat. That confidence would have to change. Marcelo made his preparations with methodical care. He informed Miguel that he would be entering the forest and might not return for several days. He programmed waypoints into his GPS device, creating a digital breadcrumb trail that could help rescuers find him if something went wrong. He checked his satellite phone battery. Fully charged, he distributed his weight load, ensuring nothing rattled or made unnecessary noise. In the forest, silence was survival. At 11:45 in the morning, with the sun directly overhead and the temperature pushing past 38 degrees Celsius, Marcelo Santos, Trovão, Relâmpago, and Corisco entered the rainforest. The transition from open pasture to dense jungle was like passing through a membrane into another world. The temperature dropped immediately, the thick canopy blocking most of the sun's direct rays. The air became even more humid, if such a thing was possible, pressing against the skin like a warm, wet blanket. Sound changed too, the open space acoustics of the ranch replaced by the muffled, close quality of the forest, where every noise seemed both near and far simultaneously. The dogs worked the scent trail with professional efficiency, Trovão in the lead, the other two flanking, ensuring nothing approached from the sides. Marcelo moved behind them, his rifle unslung but not yet ready, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the forest the way a scholar reads a book. Everything seemed normal. Birds called from the canopy, insects hummed their endless symphony. A troop of capuchin monkeys chattered overhead, pausing to throw small branches and insults at the intruders below. This was the Amazon, as it had been for thousands of years, a living, breathing organism of almost incomprehensible complexity. But Marcelo couldn't shake a feeling that had settled over him like a cold hand on his shoulder. Something was wrong. The forest felt different somehow, though he couldn't articulate exactly how. It was an instinct, the kind that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations, the kind that whispered warnings in a language older than words. The jaguar's trail led deeper into the forest, away from the ranch, away from civilization. The tracks were so fresh that Marcelo knew they were closing the distance. The cat might be only hours ahead, possibly less. This should have been encouraging. Instead, it filled him with an inexplicable dread. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, Trovão stopped suddenly, his body rigid, every muscle tense. The other dogs immediately froze as well, their training overriding their hunting instincts. Marcelo raised his rifle, his finger resting alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself. Premature shots had killed more hunters than actual animal attacks. But there was nothing. No jaguar, no threat he could identify, just the endless, patient forest, watching, waiting, keeping its secrets. Then Trovão did something Marcelo had never seen in 8 years of hunting together. The dog whimpered, a sound of pure, primal fear, and took a step backward. Whatever lay ahead, Marcelo realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach, it was something beyond his considerable experience, something that frightened an animal that had faced down wild boars, caimans, and even an injured puma without hesitation. He took a deep breath, tightened his grip on the rifle, and moved forward. The forest swallowed them whole, and with every step the feeling grew stronger. They were no longer the hunters, they had become the prey. The forest had changed in ways that defied immediate explanation. Marcelo had spent 26 years navigating the Amazon, First as a boy accompanying his father, then as a young man learning the craft, and finally as a master tracker whose services were sought throughout the entire northern Amazonas region. He knew the subtle language of the jungle, the way certain birds fell silent when a predator approached, how the quality of light shifted as clouds gathered for afternoon storms, the particular smell that preceded rain by exactly 30 minutes. But this was different. This was wrong in a way that his rational mind struggled to categorize, even as his instincts screamed warnings. Travone's behavior remained deeply unsettling. The dog, normally fearless to the point of recklessness, moved forward with extreme reluctance, his ears flat against his skull, his tail tucked low. Relampago and Corisco flanked their positions, but kept glancing back at Marcelo, seeking reassurance that he couldn't honestly provide. Whatever scent they were following, it wasn't producing the typical hunting excitement. Instead, they moved with the cautious alertness of animals entering hostile territory. Marcelo checked his GPS device. They had traveled approximately 4 kilometers from the Ferreira ranch, moving steadily northwest into an area of primary forest that had likely never been logged or significantly disturbed by human activity. The canopy here reached heights of 40 to 50 meters, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere where shafts of sunlight penetrated like divine spotlights, illuminating small stages of forest floor while leaving the surrounding areas in deep shadow. The jaguar's tracks remained clear and purposeful. The cat was moving in a straight line, not the typical meandering pattern of an animal hunting or patrolling territory. It was going somewhere specific. This observation added another layer of concern to Marcelo's growing unease. Predators didn't usually move with such determination unless they were heading to a den, fleeing from something, or responding to some stimulus that humans couldn't perceive. At 3:15 in the afternoon, they reached a small creek, one of thousands of unnamed waterways that fed into the larger river systems. The water ran clear and cold, flowing over smooth stones worn to perfection by centuries of passage. Marcelo called a halt, allowing the dogs to drink and giving himself time to assess the situation. He knelt by the creek, studying the soft mud along its banks. The jaguar had paused here as well, its tracks showing that it had drunk from the stream before continuing. But there were other tracks too, and these sent a chill down Marcelo's spine, despite the oppressive heat. Human footprints, bare feet. At least 3 different individuals, possibly more. The prints were relatively fresh, perhaps a day old, maybe less. They crossed the creek and headed in the same direction as the jaguar. Marcelo's first thought was of indigenous people. Several uncontacted tribes were known to exist in this region, groups who had deliberately chosen to avoid interaction with the outside world. The Brazilian government, through FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation, had established protected zones where these tribes could maintain their traditional ways of life without interference. Marcelo had always scrupulously respected these boundaries, and the thought that he might have inadvertently crossed into protected territory filled him with immediate concern. He pulled out his satellite phone and checked his coordinates against the map data he had downloaded before leaving. According to the official records, he was still outside any designated indigenous territory, but he knew better than to trust maps completely. The Amazon was vast, and the movements of uncontacted tribes were, by definition, poorly documented. It was entirely possible that a group had moved into this area, or that the maps were simply inaccurate. The ethical implications weighed heavily on him. If there were uncontacted indigenous people in this area, his presence represented a potentially catastrophic threat to them. Isolated tribes had no immunity to common diseases that were trivial annoyances to the outside world. A simple cold virus could devastate an entire community. Measles, influenza, even the bacteria that caused tooth decay could prove fatal. But the jaguar had also headed in this direction. If the cat had learned to view humans as prey or had established a territory that overlapped with these people, the situation could turn deadly very quickly. A jaguar that had killed cattle might not distinguish between a cow and a human, especially a child or an elderly person who couldn't defend themselves effectively. Marcelo made a decision. He would continue tracking, but with extreme caution. If he encountered any indigenous people, he would immediately withdraw. He would not attempt contact, would not speak, would simply retreat as quietly as possible and report his findings to Funai. They had trained mediators who could assess the situation and determine the appropriate course of action. The dogs seemed to sense his renewed tension. They moved even more carefully, their hunting instincts now tempered by the awareness that they were operating in complex, potentially dangerous circumstances. The terrain began to change as they continued. The forest floor, previously relatively flat, started to rise, forming small hills and ravines carved by ancient water flows. The vegetation became denser, with thick clusters of heliconia and philodendron creating natural barriers that had to be carefully navigated. Marcelo's machete saw more use, though he wielded it sparingly, cutting only what was absolutely necessary and doing so as quietly as possible. At 4:30 in the afternoon, they reached the top of a particularly steep incline. Marcelo, breathing heavily from the exertion, paused to survey the landscape below. What he saw made him freeze completely, his mind struggling to process the scene. A small clearing lay approximately 200 meters ahead, perhaps 50 meters in diameter. In the center of the clearing stood three structures that could only be described as shelters, cone-shaped frames constructed from branches and covered with large leaves. Smoke rose from a small fire that burned in the clearing's center. Several figures moved around the area, too distant and obscured by vegetation for Marcelo to make out details, but definitely human. But it was what surrounded the clearing that truly shocked him. The trees forming the clearing's perimeter had been marked, their bark stripped away in wide bands that revealed the pale wood beneath. And on these exposed surfaces, someone had carved elaborate designs, geometric patterns, representations of animals, and symbols whose meanings Marcelo couldn't begin to guess. The artistry was remarkable, demonstrating both skill and purpose. However, one image dominated all the others, repeated on tree after tree around the entire clearing's circumference. It was a representation of a large feline, unmistakably a jaguar, but rendered in a style that seemed to elevate it beyond a mere animal. The jaguar was depicted rearing on its hind legs, its front paws raised, its mouth open in what could have been a roar or a cry. Around this central figure, smaller human forms were shown in various poses of what appeared to be reverence or worship. Marcelo felt his stomach tighten. This was not simply an indigenous settlement. This was a ceremonial site, a sacred place. The implications multiplied in his mind. If these people had a spiritual connection to jaguars, if they viewed the cats as sacred or totemic animals, then the situation with the cattle-killing jaguar became infinitely more complicated. He was about to signal the dogs to retreat when Trovão suddenly went rigid again, his gaze fixed not on the clearing below, but on something in the forest to their left. Marcelo turned slowly, bringing his rifle up, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. The jaguar stood not 20 meters away, partially concealed by a large kapok tree trunk. It was massive, larger than any jaguar Marcelo had ever seen, its coat a rich gold overlaid with rosettes so perfectly formed they seemed painted rather than natural. But it was the animal's eyes that truly captured Marcelo's attention. They were fixed directly on him, with an intensity that went beyond simple predator assessment. There was intelligence there, awareness, something that felt almost like recognition. For several heartbeats, neither human nor animal moved. The dogs, responding to some unspoken command from Marcelo, remained absolutely still, not even growling. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, the constant background noise of insects and birds fading to silence. Then the jaguar did something that Marcelo would later struggle to describe coherently. It turned its head deliberately toward the clearing below, then back to Marcelo, then again to the clearing. The gesture was unmistakable. It was directing his attention, communicating intent. The animal repeated this motion 3 times before stepping backward into the dense vegetation and disappearing as silently as it had appeared. Marcelo stood frozen, his mind reeling. In 26 years of tracking, he had encountered jaguars on numerous occasions. He had seen them hunting, sleeping, mating, fighting. He had witnessed the full spectrum of jaguar behavior, but he had never, ever seen anything that remotely resembled what he had just experienced. Animals didn't communicate with humans like that. They didn't demonstrate such obvious intentionality, unless everything he thought he knew about jaguar behavior was incomplete. A sound from the clearing below snapped him back to immediate awareness. One of the figures had separated from the others and was walking directly toward his position, moving with the confident efficiency of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Marcelo's first instinct was to retreat, but curiosity and something else, something he couldn't quite name, kept him in place. The figure emerged from the heavier vegetation into a small open area where afternoon sunlight penetrated the canopy. Marcelo could now see that it was a man, probably in his 60s, though age was difficult to assess. He was lean and muscular, his skin deeply tanned and marked with intricate tattoos that covered his chest, arms, and face. He wore simple cloth wrapped around his waist and carried a long bow, though it was unstrung and clearly not prepared for use. Most strikingly, he wore a headdress made from jaguar fur and what appeared to be jaguar teeth, creating the impression of a human-feline hybrid. The man stopped approximately 10 meters from Marcelo's position and spoke in a language that Marcelo didn't recognize, though certain phonetic elements suggested it might be related to Baniwa or one of the other Arawak languages spoken in the region. His tone was not hostile, but seemed questioning, perhaps even welcoming. Marcelo made a quick decision. He carefully lowered his rifle, pointing it at the ground in a non-threatening position, and raised one hand in a universal gesture of peace. He spoke slowly in Portuguese, knowing the man likely wouldn't understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey non-aggressive intent. "I mean no harm. I am tracking a jaguar that has been killing cattle. I did not know there were people here. I will leave if that is what you wish." The man tilted his head, studying Marcelo with the same intense attention the jaguar had displayed. Then he smiled, revealing teeth that were surprisingly intact for someone his age living without modern dental care. He gestured toward the clearing, clearly inviting Marcelo to follow. Every instinct Marcelo possessed screamed that this was a mistake. Uncontacted indigenous peoples were uncontacted for good reasons. History was filled with catastrophic examples of what happened when isolated populations encountered the outside world. Disease, cultural disruption, violence, all of these had followed contact more often than not. But something else warred with these concerns. The jaguar's strange behavior, the ceremonial markings, the man's calm, knowing demeanor. The growing certainty that whatever was happening here was important, possibly critical, and that turning away might have consequences he couldn't foresee. Marcelo made another decision, one that would alter the course of his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. He commanded the dogs to stay, using hand signals to reinforce the order. Trovin whined softly, but obeyed, settling into a watchful position with the other 2 dogs flanking him. Then, leaving his rifle on the ground but keeping his machete in its sheath, Marcelo followed the stranger toward the clearing. As they descended the slope, Marcelo became aware of other presences in the forest around them. Figures moved parallel to their path, barely visible among the vegetation. He counted at least 6, possibly more. They were being escorted, he realized, or perhaps guarded. The distinction seemed important, though he wasn't sure which interpretation was correct. The clearing, when they entered it, proved even more remarkable than it had appeared from above. The fire in the center was carefully maintained, producing very little smoke, indicating extremely dry wood and considerable skill in fire management. The 3 shelters were more sophisticated than they had initially appeared, with internal structures that suggested permanent or semi-permanent occupation rather than temporary camping. But it was the people who truly captured Marcelo's attention. There were 12 of them in total, ranging from young children to elderly individuals. The children played near one of the shelters, their laughter a universal sound that transcended cultural boundaries. The women worked at various tasks, preparing food, weaving what appeared to be baskets, tending to the fire. The men, younger than Marcelo's guide but showing similar tattoo patterns, stood at the clearing's edge, watching the newcomer with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion. The guide led Marcelo to the clearing's center, near the fire. He gestured for Marcelo to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, Marcelo complied, settling into a cross-legged position that would be easy to rise from quickly if necessary. The guide sat across from him, the fire between them, and began to speak. The language remained incomprehensible to Marcelo, but the guide seemed determined to communicate. He pointed to himself and said what was clearly a name, Kayapo. Then he pointed to Marcelo, eyebrows raised in question. "Marcelo," he replied, touching his own chest. Kayapo nodded, pleased, then launched into what appeared to be a lengthy explanation, using elaborate hand gestures and occasionally pointing to the forest, the carved trees, and the sky above. Marcelo struggled to follow, catching only fragments of meaning through context and gesture. But certain themes emerged from the communication attempt. The jaguar was important, that much was clear. Kayapo kept making the same gesture, hands raised like claws, combined with a particular facial expression that Marcelo eventually recognized as imitation of a jaguar's hunting focus. The clearing and its carvings were related to the jaguar, obviously a sacred or ceremonial connection, and something was wrong, some disruption or danger that seemed to involve both the jaguar and, surprisingly, the outside world from which Marcelo had come. As the sun moved toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Marcelo began to understand, however imperfectly, that he had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple cattle predation problem. The jaguar wasn't just a dangerous animal following instinct, it was caught in the middle of something larger, a conflict between worlds that were colliding in ways that threatened both. Kayapo suddenly stood, his expression changing to one of urgency. He pointed toward the western edge of the clearing, where the forest met the cleared space. Following his gesture, Marcelo saw movement among the trees. For a moment, he thought the jaguar had returned, but what emerged from the forest was not a jaguar. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, and she was running. Her face was contorted in fear, and blood streamed from a wound on her left arm. Behind her, Marcelo could hear voices, harsh and aggressive, speaking Portuguese with the rough accent of the frontier. The peaceful clearing erupted into chaos as the indigenous people scattered toward their shelters. Kayapo's face transformed from welcoming to fierce in an instant. He turned to Marcelo, and in his eyes Marcelo saw a question and a challenge. Which side would he choose? The young woman stumbled into the clearing and collapsed near the fire, her breathing ragged and desperate. Blood continued to flow from the wound on her arm, a deep gash that looked like it had come from a machete or knife rather than an animal attack. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted between Kayapo, Marcelo, and the forest edge from which she had emerged. Clearly expecting her pursuers to appear at any moment, Kayapo moved with remarkable speed for a man his age, dropping to one knee beside the woman and examining her injury with practiced efficiency. He called out something in his language, and immediately two of the women rushed from one of the shelters, carrying what appeared to be medicinal plants and strips of cloth. The children had been ushered inside the shelters by the other adults, their earlier laughter replaced by frightened silence. Marcelo's mind raced, calculating possibilities and consequences with the speed born of decades making split-second survival decisions. The voices in the forest were getting closer, perhaps 100 meters away now, maybe less. He counted at least 3 distinct speakers, possibly 4. Their Portuguese was crude and punctuated with curses that marked them as garimpeiros, illegal gold miners who operated throughout the Amazon with complete disregard for law, indigenous rights, or environmental protection. The garimperos were a plague on the region, leaving behind poisoned rivers from mercury contamination, destroyed forest, and violence. They operated in well-armed groups, often with the tacit support of corrupt officials who looked the other way in exchange for a share of the profits. They were known to be ruthless with anyone who interfered with their operations, and indigenous people who had no legal documentation and whose disappearances often went unreported and uninvestigated were particularly vulnerable to their brutality. Marcelo understood immediately what must have happened. This young woman, probably from a different indigenous group or perhaps from this same community outgathering, had encountered the miners. Maybe she had witnessed something they didn't want reported. Maybe they had simply decided to amuse themselves at her expense. The reason ultimately didn't matter. What mattered was that she had fled, they had pursued, and now both the woman and this entire community were in immediate danger. The men of the village had retrieved weapons, bows that were now strung and ready, spears with fire-hardened points, and blowguns that Marcelo knew could deliver darts tipped with curare poison. But these traditional weapons, effective as they were against forest animals, would be woefully inadequate against men carrying modern firearms. A bow might kill one attacker, but the sound of gunfire would eliminate any remaining defenders before they could draw a second arrow. Kayapo finished binding the woman's wound with quick, competent movements, then stood and turned to Marcelo. The older man's expression was complex, containing layers of meaning that transcended language barriers. There was determination there, and acceptance, and a deep sadness. He spoke rapidly in his own language, then gestured emphatically toward the forest path that led away from the approaching voices, clearly telling Marcelo to leave, to save himself before the situation deteriorated further. But Marcelo found himself unable to move. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was not his fight, that he had a wife and daughter waiting for him in São Gabriel da Cachoeira, that getting involved in a confrontation with armed criminals would most likely end with his death and accomplish nothing. He should retrieve his dogs, circle wide around this entire situation, and report what he had found to the authorities once he returned to civilization. Yet even as these thoughts formed, he knew he wouldn't follow them. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps something deeper, a sense that there were moments in life when a person's character was truly tested, when the choice between safety and what was right became unavoidable. His grandmother had told him stories from indigenous tradition about such moments, times when the spirits watched to see what kind of person you truly were beneath all the comfortable rationalizations. He thought of Isabella, of the question she had asked that morning about whether he would kill the jaguar. He had told her that sometimes impossible choices had to be made to protect people. Now he faced his own impossible choice, and running away, leaving these people to face armed criminals alone, was not something he could reconcile with the man he wanted his daughter to believe he was. Marcelo made his decision. He turned to Kayapo and shook his head firmly, then pointed to himself and then to the ground, indicating he would stay. The old man's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in assessment. He studied Marcelo for a long moment before nodding slowly, a gesture that seemed to convey both respect and resignation. Moving quickly, Marcelo ran back up the slope to where he had left the dogs and his rifle. Trovão and the others greeted him with relief, having clearly heard the commotion below, and struggled with the instinct to investigate versus the command to stay. Marcelo grabbed his rifle, checked the chamber to confirm it was loaded, and retrieved the extra ammunition from his pack. He had 23 rounds total. Not much, but potentially enough if used wisely. He also activated his satellite phone and quickly composed a text message to Claudia. Emergency situation. Indigenous village under attack by garimperos. My coordinates attached. Send authorities immediately. Do not worry. I love you. The message would take a few minutes to transmit through the satellite network, but once it did, at least someone would know what had happened if the worst occurred. When he returned to the clearing, the village men had taken defensive positions at the forest edge, hidden among the vegetation. Kayapo directed Marcelo to a position behind a large fallen log that provided excellent cover, while offering a clear view of the approach path the garimperos would most likely use. The old man positioned himself nearby, his bow ready, a quiver of arrows at his feet. The voices were very close now, less than 50 meters away. Marcelo could hear them clearly, rough men complaining about the terrain, bragging about what they would do when they caught the Indian bitch, making crude jokes that turned Marcelo's stomach. He counted 4 distinct voices, which meant at least 4 men, possibly more who weren't speaking. Then they emerged into view, and Marcelo felt his jaw clench. There were 5 of them, dressed in the typical garimpero fashion, rubber boots, torn shirts, pants stained with mud, and God knew what else. 4 carried machetes, and the 5th, apparently the leader, carried a shotgun. They were all young, probably ranging from their early 20s to mid-30s, with the hard, desperate look of men who had nothing to lose and no moral constraints to guide their actions. The leader stopped at the clearing's edge, surveying the scene with obvious surprise. He clearly hadn't expected to find an organized village, just a lone indigenous woman easy to terrorize. His eyes moved across the shelters, the fire, and the carved trees with the calculating assessment of someone evaluating potential profit. "Well, well," he said loudly in Portuguese, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Looks like we found ourselves a whole village of savages. That means we've got options, boys. The Indian bitch is just the beginning." One of his companions laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "The NGO people pay good money for information about uncontacted tribes. We could sell the coordinates, let them come do their protection work, and meanwhile we strip this area clean before anyone official shows up. Or," another man suggested, "we just take what we want now. Nobody knows these Indians are here. Nobody will miss them. We could have some fun, take whatever supplies they've got, and be gone before anyone's the wiser." Marcelo's finger moved to his rifle's trigger guard, not yet on the trigger itself, but ready. His heart pounded, but his hands remained steady. Years of hunting had taught him to control fear, to channel adrenaline into focus rather than panic. He glanced at Kayapo, who was watching the intruders with an expression of controlled rage. The leader took a step into the clearing, his shotgun held casually but ready. "Listen up, savages!" he shouted. "We know you can hear me, even if you can't understand proper language. Send out the woman, and maybe we leave the rest of you alone. Make us come get her, and things get ugly for everyone." Silence answered him. The clearing appeared empty except for the burning fire. The garimperos exchanged glances, uncertainty beginning to replace their earlier confidence. They were accustomed to encountering isolated indigenous people who fled from confrontation, not organized communities prepared to defend themselves. "Your funeral," the leader muttered, raising his shotgun and firing a blast into the air. The sound was deafening, echoing off the trees and sending birds exploding from the canopy in panicked flight. "That's your warning shot. Next one goes into those huts where you're hiding your women and children." That was when Kayapo stood up, stepping out from his concealment with his bow drawn and an arrow nocked. He said something in his language, his tone making it clear that it was a command to leave. The garimperos froze, startled by his sudden appearance. Then the leader began to laugh. "Look at this old man. Thinks he's going to scare us with a bow and arrow. Old-timer, this isn't the Stone Age anymore. You bring arrows to a gunfight, you die simple as that." He raised his shotgun, pointing it directly at Kayapo's chest. Time seemed to slow. Marcelo saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. He saw Kayapo's absolute stillness, showing no fear, no intention to back down. He saw the other garimperos spreading out, preparing to rush the clearing once their leader fired the first shot. Marcelo made a choice that he knew would haunt him regardless of outcome. He stood up from behind his log, his rifle raised and aimed directly at the leader's center mass, and spoke in a voice that cut through the tension like a machete through vines. "Drop the weapon, now!" The leader spun toward him, his shotgun swinging to target this new threat. For a moment, Marcelo thought the man would actually fire, would force the situation into violence that could only end badly for everyone. But something in Marcelo's expression, or perhaps the steady way he held his rifle, Or maybe just the survival instinct that had kept the man alive in a dangerous profession made the Garimpero hesitate. "Who the hell are you?" the leader demanded. "My name is Marcelo Santos. I'm a licensed hunter working under contract with the Ferreira Ranch to track a problem jaguar. I have legal authorization to be in this area, and I have already transmitted my GPS coordinates and a report of this situation to authorities. The police and FUNAI agents are likely already on their way." This was a partial bluff. The message had been sent, but whether authorities would arrive quickly or at all was far from certain. However, the Garimperos didn't know that. The mention of FUNAI in particular seemed to worry them. The Foundation had increasingly powerful legal authority, and penalties for attacking indigenous people had become severe enough to actually result in prosecution. "You're lying," the leader said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Am I? Do you want to bet your freedom on that? Or maybe your life? Because I guarantee you, if you fire that shotgun at this man, I will put a bullet through your spine before the sound stops echoing. And my companions here," he gestured vaguely toward the forest, where he knew other village men were hidden. "They might not have guns, but their arrows carry poison that will kill you before you make it 100 meters. So let me be very clear. You have one opportunity to walk away from this situation alive and free. Take it." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 seconds. The leader's eyes darted between Marcelo, Kayapo, and the forest around them, where he now suspected additional threats lurked. His companions had stopped spreading out and were looking to him for guidance, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of an actual, prepared resistance. Finally, slowly, the leader lowered his shotgun. "This isn't over," he said, trying to salvage some dignity from the retreat. "We'll remember this. We'll remember you. I hope you do," Marcelo replied calmly. "I hope you remember it every time you think about attacking defenseless people. Now leave. And if I ever hear of you in this region again, I won't bother with warnings." The Garimperos backed away, keeping their weapons ready but not aimed. When they reached the forest edge, they turned and moved quickly into the vegetation, their voices fading as they retreated. Marcelo kept his rifle up until the sounds disappeared completely, until the forest returned to its normal symphony of insects and birds. Only then did he lower his weapon, and only then did his hands begin to shake with the adrenaline after effect. He had just threatened to kill a man, had come within a heartbeat of actually doing it. The reality of how close they had all come to violence and death crashed over him like a wave. Kayapo approached, lowering his own bow. He reached out and placed a hand on Marcelo's shoulder, squeezing firmly. The gesture transcended language, conveying gratitude, respect, and a bond forged in shared danger. Then the old man turned and called out to his people, his voice reassuring, bringing them out from their shelters and hiding places. The young woman who had been injured was helped to her feet by the village women. She approached Marcelo and Kayapo, speaking rapidly in her language, tears streaming down her face. She kept gesturing toward Marcelo, clearly expressing gratitude. One of the village women translated her words into the indigenous language Kayapo spoke, and the old man turned to Marcelo. Through elaborate pantomime and gestures, Kayapo managed to convey a basic version of the woman's story. Her name was something like Yara, and she was indeed from another community several days' walk to the east. She had been gathering medicinal plants when she encountered the Garimperos at their illegal mining camp. They had seen her and given chase, pursuing her for hours before she finally reached this village seeking sanctuary. But there was more. Kayapo's expression grew grave as he continued his gestural explanation. The mining camp was large, perhaps 30 or 40 men. They were using heavy equipment, poisoning a tributary that fed into the river system that sustained multiple indigenous communities and countless villages downstream. The environmental damage was catastrophic, and the miners were becoming increasingly bold, venturing farther from their base camp, encountering indigenous people more frequently. And most troubling of all, The jaguar that Marcelo had been tracking, the sacred cat represented in all the ceremonial carvings, had been seen near the mining camp 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Kayapo seemed to believe this was not coincidence but intentional, that the jaguar was trying to communicate something, to draw attention to the threat the miners represented. Marcelo felt the pieces beginning to fall into place. The jaguar hadn't been hunting cattle out of hunger or injury. It had been trying to bring humans, specifically someone like Marcelo, who would follow the tracks, to this area. The cattle kills had been messages, breadcrumbs leading to a larger problem. It seemed impossible, required him to accept that a wild animal could possess motivations and understanding far beyond normal animal cognition. Yet he had seen the jaguar's behavior with his own eyes, the deliberate communication, the intentional directing of his attention. As the sun set and darkness began to claim the forest, the village gathered around the fire. Despite the day's trauma, there was a palpable sense of relief and even celebration. They had faced a terrible threat and survived. Yara's wound had been properly treated with plant medicines that Marcelo recognized from his grandmother's teachings: copaiba oil to prevent infection, and crushed leaves from a plant he couldn't identify to reduce pain and promote healing. Food was shared, simple but nourishing: roasted cassava, fish that had been caught that morning, and fruits gathered from the forest. Marcelo ate gratefully, realizing he hadn't consumed anything since his quick breakfast 12 hours earlier. The dogs, who had remained on the slope during the confrontation, were called down and fed as well, earning them friendly attention from the village children who had overcome their fear and were now fascinated by the animals. As the night deepened and the fire burned lower, Kayapo produced a roughly carved map etched into a piece of bark. Using a combination of gestures, drawings in the dirt, and patient repetition, he showed Marcelo the location of the mining camp. It was approximately 8 kilometers to the northeast, in a valley near a stream called Igarape Preto, Black Stream, on the few maps that detailed this remote region. The old man's intentions became clear. He wanted Marcelo to see the camp, to witness the destruction, to serve as a bridge between his world and the outside authorities who might have the power to stop this environmental and cultural catastrophe. Marcelo was being asked to transform from hunter into advocate, from solitary tracker into messenger. It was a role he had never sought, never trained for, never wanted. But looking around at the faces illuminated by firelight, at Yara with her bandaged arm, at the children who had so recently been huddled in fear, at Kayapo who had welcomed him despite having every reason to fear contact with the outside world, Marcelo understood that some responsibilities chose you rather than the other way around. He nodded his agreement to Kayapo's unspoken request. Tomorrow they would go to the mining camp. They would document what was happening. And then Marcelo would do everything in his power to bring the full weight of the law down on the men who were destroying this irreplaceable place. That night, Marcelo slept lightly in one of the shelters, his rifle within arm's reach, his satellite phone showing that his earlier message had successfully transmitted. The dogs curled up near him, Trovan's head resting on his leg, providing warmth and the comfort of their familiar presence. In his dreams, he saw the jaguar again, those intelligent amber eyes watching him, judging him, and in the dream, he somehow understood what the great cat was thinking. You have been chosen. You have been tested. Now comes the hardest part. Now you must follow through. When Marcelo woke before dawn, he discovered that Kayapo was already awake, along with 3 younger men from the village. They were prepared to travel, carrying weapons and small packs of supplies. The old man approached Marcelo and made a simple gesture. It was time to go. Together, this unlikely alliance, a Brazilian hunter, his 3 dogs, and 4 indigenous warriors, set out into the pre-dawn darkness to confront an evil that threatened everything this forest represented. Behind them, the carved images of the sacred jaguar seemed to watch, the firelight creating the illusion that the great cats were breathing, alive, waiting to see if these humans would prove worthy of their trust. The forest swallowed them, and the real test began. The journey to the mining camp began in the peculiar darkness that exists just before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day. Marcelo moved through the forest with Kayapo and the three younger warriors whose names he had learned through gesture and repetition, Takuma, Makari, and Ubirajara. Each man moved with the fluid efficiency that marked those who had spent their entire lives in the jungle, their feet finding purchase on uncertain ground, their bodies instinctively avoiding thorns and obstacles that would have torn at someone less experienced. The dogs adapted their usual hunting behavior to match the group's cautious approach. Trovon, sensing the tension and the need for stealth, abandoned his typical ranging pattern and stayed close to Marcelo's side. Relampago and Corisco flanked the group, their ears constantly swiveling, cataloguing every sound in the awakening forest. As the first light began to filter through the canopy, painting everything in shades of grey and green, Marcelo could hear the forest coming alive. Howler monkeys began their territorial calls, a sound that started low and built to a roar that could be heard for kilometers. Birds initiated their morning chorus, each species adding its voice to the symphony. Under different circumstances, this would have been a peaceful, even spiritual experience. Now, every sound made Marcelo tense, wondering if it might mask the approach of danger. They traveled in silence for approximately 3 hours, covering ground that Marcelo estimated at around 6 kilometers. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, with steep ravines carved by seasonal streams and dense undergrowth that required careful navigation. Twice, Kayapo stopped the group completely, his hand raised in warning as he detected something that Marcelo's less experienced senses had missed. Each time, they waited in absolute stillness until the old man was satisfied that whatever had concerned him had passed or proved non-threatening. At 8:30 in the morning, Takuma, who had been scouting ahead, returned with an urgent expression. He spoke rapidly to Kayapo in their language, gesturing emphatically toward the northeast. The old man's face grew grim. He turned to Marcelo and, through the combination of gestures and simple words they had developed, conveyed that they were close, perhaps 1 kilometer from the camp, and that they needed to proceed with extreme caution. Marcelo checked his satellite phone. He had 43% battery remaining, enough for several hours of use if needed. He also confirmed that he still had a signal, weak but present. He composed another message to Claudia. Approaching illegal mining operation with indigenous allies. Will document and report. If you don't hear from me by tomorrow evening, send coordinates to Federal Police and Funai. Tell Isabella I love her and I'm proud of her. He hesitated before hitting send, wondering if he was being melodramatic, then decided that caution was better than regret, and transmitted the message. The forest began to change as they drew nearer to the camp. At first, the alterations were subtle. A broken branch here, a disturbed patch of undergrowth there, boot prints in soft mud that spoke of frequent human passage. Then the changes became more dramatic. Trees showed machete scars where branches had been cut for firewood or to clear paths. Garbage appeared, plastic bottles, food containers, cigarette butts, all the detritus of human occupation carelessly discarded. Then came the smell. It hit Marcelo like a physical blow. The acrid stench of diesel fuel mixed with something metallic and poisonous. Mercury. The garimperos were using mercury to separate gold from sediment, a technique that was both highly effective and catastrophically destructive. Mercury contamination persisted in the environment for decades, accumulating in fish tissue and poisoning everything up the food chain, including humans. Kayapo's expression had transformed from grim to something approaching despair. This was his world being destroyed, the forest that had sustained his people for generations being systematically poisoned for the sake of a metal that held no value in his traditional worldview. They reached a vantage point on a hillside that overlooked the mining operation, and Marcelo felt his stomach turn at what he saw below. The camp was larger than he had imagined, a sprawling settlement that housed at least 40 men, possibly more. Multiple large tents served as living quarters. A central area contained what appeared to be a kitchen and common space. But it was the mining operation itself that truly demonstrated the scale of destruction. A stream that must have once been pristine had been transformed into a muddy, poisoned channel. The miners had constructed a series of sluices and mechanical separators, powered by diesel generators, whose constant rumble could be heard even at this distance. The surrounding forest had been clear-cut for 50 meters on either side of the stream, leaving a barren, devastated landscape of stumps and mud. The water flowing through the operation was a sickly brown color, and Marcelo knew that downstream this poison was spreading through the river system, killing fish, contaminating drinking water, and destroying the ecological balance that indigenous communities depended upon. Men moved around the camp with casual efficiency, some working the sluices, others using high-pressure hoses to blast sediment from the stream banks, still others maintaining equipment or preparing food. They were heavily armed. Marcelo counted at least 6 visible firearms, mostly shotguns and rifles, though he suspected there were more weapons inside the tents. These were not desperate individuals engaged in small-scale illegal mining. This was an organized operation with significant financial backing and the infrastructure to defend itself. Marcelo pulled out his satellite phone and began taking photographs, careful to keep the device's screen dimmed to avoid creating a reflection that might give away their position. He documented everything: the scale of the operation, the environmental destruction, the weapons, the number of personnel. He also activated the phone's video function and recorded several minutes of footage, narrating quietly in Portuguese to provide context. This is Marcelo Santos, licensed hunter, recording on December 3rd, 2025 at approximately 9:15 in the morning. My GPS coordinates are being logged with this recording. I am witnessing an illegal gold mining operation in the Brazilian Amazon, approximately 8 kilometers northeast of the indigenous village that has been marked on my GPS track. This operation is using mercury processing, has clear-cut approximately 4 to 5 hectares of primary rainforest, and is contaminating the Igarape Preto stream system. I count approximately 40 individuals present, multiple firearms visible, significant infrastructure indicating long-term occupation. The operation poses an immediate threat to indigenous communities downstream and represents catastrophic environmental damage. I'm documenting this at the request of indigenous people who have been directly threatened by personnel from this camp. As he finished recording, movement below caught his attention. A group of men had gathered near the central tent, and they appeared to be arguing about something. One man, older than most of the others and carrying himself with obvious authority, seemed to be giving orders. Marcelo zoomed in with his phone's camera, capturing images of the man's face. If this was the operation's leader, identifying him could be crucial for any subsequent investigation. Then something happened that made Marcelo's blood run cold. One of the miners pointed toward the hillside where they were hidden, gesturing emphatically. The leader pulled out binoculars and began scanning the forest. Marcelo immediately ducked down, signaling the others to do the same. Had they been spotted? Had some careless movement or reflection given them away? Kayapo grabbed Marcelo's arm and pointed urgently back the way they had come, clearly indicating they needed to leave immediately. But before they could move, Trovão growled, a low warning sound that made every hair on Marcelo's neck stand up. The dog was looking not toward the camp below, but behind them, back toward the forest they had just traveled through. Marcelo turned slowly, and his heart sank. 6 men from the mining camp were emerging from the vegetation, approximately 30 meters behind their position. They must have been on patrol, or perhaps returning from some task, and had unknowingly approached from the rear. The miners froze when they saw the group on the hillside, surprise registering on their faces for perhaps 2 seconds before training and survival instinct took over. "Intruders!" one of them shouted toward the camp below. "We got Indians and someone else on the North Ridge." The camp below erupted into activity. Men grabbed weapons and began running toward the hillside. The 6 miners behind Marcelo's group spread out, cutting off the retreat path. Marcelo made a split-second tactical assessment. They were trapped between 2 groups with superior numbers and firepower. Fighting would result in casualties on both sides, and even if they somehow won the immediate engagement, more miners would come. Flight was impossible with enemies both ahead and behind. That left one option: negotiation from a position of strength. Marcelo stood up slowly, his hands raised to show they were empty, his rifle still slung across his back. "Nobody needs to die today," he shouted in Portuguese, his voice carrying across the hillside. "We're not here to attack you. We're documenting this operation, and that documentation has already been transmitted to authorities. Attacking us will only make your situation worse." The leader from the camp had climbed halfway up the hillside, breathing heavily but keeping his shotgun trained in Marcelo's direction. Up close, the man was perhaps 55 years old, with grey stubble on his jaw and eyes that held the calculating coldness of someone who had committed violence before and would do so again without hesitation. "You think you're clever?" the leader said, his voice surprisingly calm. "You think because you've sent some messages, we're just going to let you walk away? You've seen too much. You know where we are. And these Indians with you, they're probably from that village we've been hearing about. You've just signed everyone's death warrant, friend." Marcelo kept his hands raised, but met the man's gaze steadily. "My name is Marcelo Santos. I'm a licensed hunter with documented legal authority to be in this region. My GPS track, photographs, videos, and 2 separate text messages have all been transmitted via satellite phone to my wife, who has standing instructions to forward everything to the federal police, FUNAI, and IBAMA if I don't check in regularly. Right now, at this very moment, my information is sitting in multiple inboxes. If anything happens to me or these men, you're not dealing with a mystery disappearance. You're dealing with a murder investigation that will bring the full weight of federal law enforcement down on this operation." The leader's expression didn't change, but Marcelo saw uncertainty flicker in the eyes of some of the other miners. These were criminals, yes, but most were probably ordinary men trying to make money in an economy that offered few legitimate opportunities. They were willing to break environmental laws and threaten indigenous people. But murder of a documented Brazilian citizen was a different category of crime entirely. "You're bluffing," the leader said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Am I? Do you want to risk decades in federal prison to find out? Because that's what you're gambling with. And let me tell you something else. See that forest behind you? It's not empty. The indigenous people here have been watching this operation for weeks. They know your patterns, your numbers, your routines. If violence starts here today, it won't end with us. You'll be fighting a guerrilla war against people who know this terrain infinitely better than you do. People who can disappear into the forest and return to strike when you're most vulnerable. Is the gold you're extracting worth that?" As Marcelo spoke, he became aware of movement in the forest around them. The indigenous warriors who had accompanied them had not fled, but had melted into the vegetation, and now Marcelo could see subtle signs of their presence. A shift in shadows here, the barely visible outline of a drawn bow there. Kayapo had positioned his people perfectly, creating the impression of a much larger force waiting in ambush. The leader saw it too. His eyes darted to the forest, recognizing that the tactical situation was more complex than he had initially assessed. A prolonged standoff favored the indigenous defenders, who could simply wait while the miners, exposed on the hillside, would eventually have to make a move. "What do you want?" the leader finally asked. "We want to leave, peacefully, without anyone getting hurt, and we want your operation to pack up and move out of this area within 48 hours. That's it. You get 2 days to disappear before the authorities arrive. Take that gift and run with it, because I guarantee you the federal police response is coming regardless. This recording, this evidence, it's already out there. But if you're gone when they arrive, maybe you live to mine another day in some other location. If you're still here, you're going to federal prison for a very long time." The leader studied Marcelo for a long moment, weighing options, calculating odds. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met, or the stupidest. I haven't decided which." "Does it matter?" Marcelo replied. "What matters is whether you're smart enough to take the exit I'm offering you." Another long silence stretched between them, broken only by the constant rumble of the generators below and the normal sounds of the forest. Finally, the leader lowered his shotgun slightly, not completely, but enough to signal a de-escalation. "You've got 12 hours to get out of this area," he said. "After that, if I see you or any of your Indian friends anywhere near this camp, all bets are off. And don't think your documentation protects you forever. Files get lost. Messages disappear. Accidents happen to people in the jungle all the time." It wasn't the agreement Marcelo had asked for, but it was enough. He nodded slowly. 12 hours. We'll be gone. But understand this. If any indigenous people from this region are harmed, if any mysterious disappearances occur, my documentation specifically names this camp, and your face is on video. There will be no mystery about who's responsible. The leader's jaw clenched, but he jerked his head in a gesture that was half nod, half dismissal. He began backing down the hillside, his weapons still ready, his men following his lead. The 6 miners who had blocked the retreat path slowly melted back into the forest, moving toward the camp rather than pursuing the confrontation. Marcelo waited until they were out of immediate sight before allowing himself to breathe fully again. His hands were shaking, his shirt soaked through with sweat that was only partially attributable to the heat and humidity. He had just played the most dangerous game of his life, bluffing with incomplete information, betting everything that the miners' self-interest would outweigh their willingness to commit murder. Kayapo emerged from the forest, his expression unreadable. The other warriors followed, their weapons still ready, but their postures slightly relaxed. The old man approached Marcelo and placed both hands on his shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. Then he did something that surprised Marcelo. He smiled, a genuine expression of respect and what might have even been affection. Through gestures, Kayapo made it clear they needed to leave the area immediately. The 12-hour grace period was better than nothing, but trusting the word of criminals was foolish. They needed to return to the village, gather the people, and move to a more secure location until they could be certain the mining camp had actually been abandoned or authorities had arrived to secure the area. The journey back was faster than the approach had been, urgency overriding caution. They moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, pausing only briefly for water and to check that they weren't being followed. Marcelo's satellite phone showed multiple missed message notifications, which he couldn't check while moving, but the fact that messages were coming through was encouraging. It meant Claudia had received his information and was presumably acting on it. They reached the village by early afternoon, and Kayapo immediately began organizing the community for temporary relocation. The people moved with practiced efficiency, clearly having drilled for this possibility. The shelters were quickly dismantled, supplies were packed, the fire was extinguished and scattered. Within 90 minutes, the clearing showed minimal signs of occupation. Someone unfamiliar with indigenous practices might walk right through and miss that dozens of people had lived there. Yara, the young woman they had rescued, approached Marcelo before the group departed. She spoke in her language, and though Marcelo couldn't understand the specific words, the meaning was clear in her expression and tone. Gratitude, blessing, a promise that what he had done would be remembered. As the community melted into the forest, Kayapo approached Marcelo one final time. The old man produced a small, carved amulet from a pouch at his waist. It was made from dark wood, polished smooth by handling, and depicted a jaguar in a resting position. He pressed it into Marcelo's hand and closed his fingers around it, speaking softly in his language. Marcelo didn't need translation to understand this was a gift of deep significance, a token of respect and connection. He nodded, fighting the unexpected emotion that welled up in his throat, and carefully placed the amulet in his pocket. Then Kayapo did something else unexpected. He pointed to the forest in the direction they had originally met, then to Marcelo, then made the gesture he had used to represent the jaguar. The meaning seemed clear. Go back that way, and you will find what you were originally seeking, the jaguar. Marcelo watched as the indigenous community disappeared into the forest with barely a sound, their departure so smooth and practiced that within minutes it was as if they had never been there at all. He was alone again, except for his 3 dogs, standing in an empty clearing that would soon be reclaimed by the forest. He checked his satellite phone and found multiple messages from Claudia, increasingly frantic in tone. He called her, and she answered on the first ring. "Marcelo, thank God, I've been terrified. I'm safe, querida. I'm sorry I couldn't respond sooner. The situation was complicated." Complicated? "Marcelo, I forwarded your information like you asked, and the federal police contacted me within 2 hours. They've already dispatched a tactical team by helicopter. FUNAI and IBAMA are coordinating a joint operation. There are federal warrants being issued right now. What did you find out there?" Marcelo gave her a brief summary of the past 2 days. The indigenous village, the confrontation with the garimperos, the mining camp, the standoff. As he spoke, he could hear her emotions shifting from fear to anger to pride and back to fear again. "You could have been killed," she said finally, her voice small. "I know. But Claudia, you should have seen those people, the village, the children. I couldn't walk away. I couldn't leave them to face that alone." There was a long pause before she responded. "I know. That's why I love you, even when you terrify me. Isabella wants to talk to you." His daughter's voice came on the line, trying to sound mature, but unable to completely hide her fear. "Papai, are you really okay?" "I'm really okay, mina fila, and I have stories to tell you when I get home. Stories about brave people who protect the forest, about difficult choices, about why sometimes doing the right thing means doing the scary thing." "Did you find the jaguar?" Marcelo looked toward the forest where Kayapo had pointed. "Not yet. But I think I know where to look now." After reassuring his family that he would be home within 2 days and promising to check in every few hours, Marcelo ended the call. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, and part of him wanted nothing more than to start the journey back to the Ferreira ranch and then home. The authorities were coming. The mining camp would be raided. His part in this was done. But Kayapo's final gesture nagged at him. The old man had known something, had been trying to tell him something important about the jaguar, and Marcelo realized that the mystery that had started this entire journey, the question of why a healthy jaguar had begun killing cattle, remained unsolved. He made a decision. He would take 1 more day, follow Kayapo's direction, and try to complete the original mission. He owed that much to Miguel Ferreira, and in a strange way, he felt he owed it to the jaguar itself. Marcelo and the dogs set out, following the path back to where he had first encountered the indigenous village. From there, he read the landscape as Kayapo had taught him through gesture, looking for the subtle signs that indicated where the jaguar would most likely be found. A game trail here, a watering spot there, the particular combination of cover and vantage point that a large predator would prefer. As the afternoon wore on, and the light began to take on the golden quality of approaching evening, Marcelo found himself in a small valley where 3 streams converged. It was perfect jaguar territory, water, abundant prey, multiple escape routes, and excellent cover. The dogs became alert, not frightened as they had been before, but focused, professional, indicating that they had picked up the cat's scent. And then he saw it. The jaguar lay on a large, flat rock beside one of the streams, perhaps 40 meters away. It was the same animal he had seen before, unmistakable in its size and the particular pattern of its rosettes. But now, in the warm evening light, Marcelo could see something he hadn't noticed before. The cat was thin, not emaciated, but definitely leaner than it should be. And when it moved, shifting position on the rock, he saw the reason. The jaguar's right rear leg bore a significant injury, a deep scar that suggested an old wound, perhaps from a territorial fight or an unsuccessful hunt. The leg was functional, but clearly caused the animal pain or limited mobility. This jaguar, magnificent as it was, had been operating with a handicap that made hunting its normal prey difficult. But it hadn't been killing cattle out of desperation. Marcelo understood that now. A desperate, injured predator would have stayed near the ranch, taking cattle repeatedly until it was killed or the injuries healed. This jaguar had killed just enough to create a trail, to bring someone like Marcelo into the forest, to lead him to the indigenous village, and inevitably to the mining camp that threatened the entire ecosystem. It seemed impossible. It required him to accept that a wild animal had possessed not just intelligence, but something approaching intentionality, the ability to plan and manipulate human behavior toward a desired outcome. Yet he had seen too much in the past days to dismiss it as coincidence. The jaguar turned its head and looked directly at Marcelo. For a long moment, their eyes met across the distance. Then the great cat stood, stretched in a movement that was both painful and graceful, and began to walk away, moving upstream, deeper into the forest, toward the protected lands where humans rarely ventured. Marcelo watched it go, making no move to raise his rifle, knowing with absolute certainty that he could not harm this animal. Whatever had happened over the past days, whatever strange communion had existed between a human and a wild predator, it had served a purpose larger than either of them. He turned and began the long journey home, his dogs at his side, the carved jaguar amulet warm against his skin. Behind him, the forest continued its eternal rhythms, hiding its secrets, protecting its children, existing in the delicate balance that humanity threatened with every passing day. 3 days later, Marcelo sat at his kitchen table in São Gabriel da Cachoeira, Claudia on one side, Isabella on the other. The television played a news report about a major federal operation that had dismantled an illegal mining camp in the Amazon, arrested 42 individuals, and seized equipment worth millions of reais. The reporter mentioned that the operation had been initiated based on documentation provided by an anonymous source, and that FUNAI had also made contact with a previously unknown indigenous group in the region who would be provided protection and support. "That was you, wasn't it, Papai?" Isabella asked, watching the news footage of handcuffed miners being led to police helicopters. "You stopped them." "Not alone," Marcelo replied quietly. "There were many people involved, brave people who risked everything to protect their home." "And the jaguar?" his daughter persisted. "What happened to the jaguar?" Marcelo thought about that moment by the stream, about amber eyes that held knowledge he couldn't fully comprehend. "The jaguar is safe. It's where it belongs, in the deep forest, far from people. It won't kill any more cattle. That I can promise." "How do you know?" "Because it got what it wanted. It brought attention to a problem that needed solving. And now that problem is solved." Isabella looked at him with her perceptive young eyes, processing this information, understanding that there was more to the story than she was being told, but respecting the boundaries her father had drawn. "Will you go back to the forest to look for it again?" Marcelo smiled and pulled out the carved amulet, showing it to his daughter. "I carry a part of that forest with me now, and I think, in some way, a part of me remains there too. But the jaguar doesn't need me to find it again. It knows where I am, just as I know where it is, and that's enough." That night, as Marcelo lay in bed beside his sleeping wife, he thought about all the impossible things he had experienced. A jaguar that seemed to possess intention and understanding beyond normal animal cognition. An indigenous community that had welcomed him, despite every historical reason to fear contact. A confrontation with armed criminals that had ended without bloodshed. A successful operation to protect both people and environment that had come together against enormous odds. He thought about the question Isabella had asked at the beginning of this journey. Would he kill the jaguar? He had answered that impossible choices sometimes had to be made. But the past days had taught him something more important. Sometimes the impossible choices resolved themselves if you had the courage to see beyond the obvious solutions, if you remained open to possibilities that defied easy categorization. The forest was dying, slowly but steadily, consumed by greed and short-sighted economic policies that valued immediate profit over long-term survival. But it was also resilient, protected by people who understood their lives were inseparable from the land, defended by forces both human and animal that worked in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Marcelo Santos, Hunter, father, husband, and now reluctant environmental defender, closed his eyes and slept, knowing that his life had been fundamentally changed by a jaguar that had led him into the forest and shown him truths that would stay with him forever. In his dreams, he walked again through the green cathedral of the Amazon, his dogs at his side, and somewhere in the shadows, amber eyes watched with approval. The hunter and his dogs had entered the forest, and nothing could have prepared them for what they found. But in finding it, in facing it, in choosing courage over safety and righteousness over convenience, they had become something more than they had been before. They had become guardians of a world that desperately needed defending. And in the deep forest, far from human eyes, a great jaguar rested on a sun-warmed rock, its injured legs slowly healing, its purpose fulfilled, watching over a realm that had existed long before humans arrived and would, with luck and courage and sacrifice, continue long after they were gone.